Hello, everyone. Welcome to Codicology Unit 3. This lecture is going to be Unit 3.1. This week in Codicology 3, we're going to be talking about a concept called the grammar of legibility. So how text and image and decoration and the marginalia that is added to these pages, to manuscript pages, punctuation, etc., all work together to impose meaning on a text and impose interpretive possibilities by readers. Our first lecture, and we're going to have 3 lectures within this unit. Our first lecture is going to consider punctuation and the development of punctuation systems from the late antique period all the way on through into the late 15th century. So let me bring the PowerPoint up and we'll get started. As soon as I can get to slideshow there, and there we go. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we're going to be talking about punctuation today, and punctuation it can be an extremely frustrating feature of medieval manuscripts. It's very, very slippery, and you will see a lot of inconsistency even within manuscripts produced in the same place during the same period. You may not see the same exact types of punctuation systems used. We'll talk a little bit about why this might be as we go through this lecture. But what we're going to actually do here is talk about the evolution of punctuation from the ancient period through the 15th century and the humanist period. We're going to be doing this in 5 main sections. So you can roughly divide the history of punctuation in the Latin West and then the subsidiary vernaculars that develop out of Latin or that develop in parallel with Latin into these 5 periods: the ancient period, the 6th century and insular period, the Carolingian period, high late medieval, and humanist. And when we go through these different sections of history or these different periods of history, you're going to see pronounced changes in the way that people thought about text, dealt with their text, and tried to either leave interpretive openings or to impose set interpretations for their readers. So beginning with the ancient, one of the most popular and oldest forms of punctuation is actually a complete lack of punctuation, and this was called scriptura continua. It's a text that is entirely reader dependent, and it requires a high degree of literacy if you're actually going to deal with writing like this. What I have up here is actually just a modern version of scriptura continua that I threw together from an English translation of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. And if you get a chance, or if you're so inclined, pause this lecture here at this point or at any point after I'm done talking about this particular slide and see if you can work your way through what this manuscript actually says. You don't have to do the entire extract here, but look and see and give particular attention to how your mind works when you're trying to tease out meaning here. And consider as you're going through, especially on this first line, unfamiliar words, unfamiliar names that you might see, and how difficult it might be to kind of impose the word separation and everything else you would need in order to make your way through this text. Now, the reason this was a popular kind of text or popular way to render your text in the antique period is because there was a pronounced belief that meaning was to be imposed by the reader, not necessarily the author. And a lot of times this interpretation via punctuation or via paused breath, because that's essentially what punctuation is where you take pauses in breath, how you inflect your voice to impose meanings such as surprise or questions, exclamations, things like that. And text was written down principally in order to be recited. So the person who was doing the orating would be the one who would impose that meaning. So what scriptura continua actually presents is a neutral text that is reciter or reader dependent. And it requires, as I said before, a very high degree of literacy that expects you not only to recognize individual letters and be able to decipher those, but then to group those letters into the appropriate syllables, then on into the words that those syllables form, grouping those individual words into shorter, meaningful clauses, having those clauses then be interpreted as full sentences, having those sentences then rendered as paragraphs. And then throughout all of that, you're to recognize rhythm and meter. And this isn't just in the case of something that is decidedly verse or poetry, but also the rhythm and meter and the flow of prose declamation. So you've got a completely neutral text here. Another ancient form of punctuation is what's called divisio per colla et commata, or division by colon and comma. This also prioritizes the idea of recitation versus silent reading, but it makes scriptura continua a little bit easier to read, actually quite a bit easier to read. And what it does here is basically imposes punctuation by format or by page layout. And if you look at this image on the right here, you'll see that we have these capital letters that begin on the left, and then there will be indentation irregularly in the lines underneath them. What we have here is the division into colon and comma phrases, basically. So the colon is the major pause or division, kind of the intact sentence unit, whereas the comma are the subsidiary clauses within that sentence. And the way that per colla et commata rendered this on the page was to begin the beginning of each new colon statement all the way to the left of the line. And then it continued all the way through however many subsidiary clauses there might be within that colon by indenting those subsidiary clauses until the colon statement was finished, at which point a new colon statement would begin with the initial all the way to the left. So here we have a visual representation of the spoken word where the person reciting from a text like this would read out with an awareness of rhythm and meter each one of these colon statements with a pronounced pause at the end of those statements before beginning the next one. Another method of ancient punctuation is the distinctiones system, and this is really rather simple. It is comprised of a single point, or a punctus, and the meaning of, or the significance of that punctuation and its value is dependent entirely on where it is placed on the line of writing. So the subdistinctio was the lowest pause and could be equated roughly to today's comma. And the placement for that would be at the baseline of the writing, so at the foot of the writing. The media distinctio was a medial pause, so something like a semicolon, maybe a colon. And that punctus, that point, was going to be put halfway up the line of writing, so halfway up the body of the letter. The distinctio was the heaviest and lengthiest pause, and this signified a period. And typically, the distinctio's placement would be at the highest point of the line at the top. And if you look at the large periods I've put at the end of each of these bullet points, you'll see exactly how those placements worked. Moving along from the ancient styles of punctuation, we go into the 6th century and the Insular period. And during the 6th century, there's a major shift in the way that written text is conceptualized. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in the ancient period, text is seen as something to be read. What you're seeing written on the page is a referent of sound. It is not a referent of anything that is silently rendered in your mind. So there's a shift of responsibility that we see happening in the 6th century where we go from the reader to the scribe as being the entity that imposes punctuation and meaning and interpretation on the text. Letters stop being graphic representations of graphic sound and convert into silent signs. Knowledge in this fashion is to be conveyed to the mind via the eye as opposed to the ear. And probably the earliest and biggest proponent of this was Isidore of Seville, who wrote in his book, The Etymologies, in book 1 of the Etymologies, that the quote here, I've got it on your slide, is "Understanding is instructed more fully when the voice of the reader is silent." This is kind of the codification of this shift in thought. And this change in focus inspires a whole bunch of things that start to really impact the development of punctuation further on into the medieval period and that still dominate, excuse me, the printed word and the written word today. So some of those changes in focus include word separation. So if we think about scriptura continua, where there's really no separation whatsoever between letters and words, we now see pronounced divisions of syllables and word units with separation between those. We have increasing layers of innovations in page layout, and we're going to see some of those in a second, and innovations in punctuation that start to develop. And what we have here on the right, unfortunately, this is not an Ohio State manuscript. This is in Europe. And we see a lot of the different kinds of punctuation symbols that Isidore was saying scribes could use in order to help impose meaning. So here we really start to see kind of some nuance really get introduced into systems of writing. By insular punctuation, what I mean are innovations to the way text is rendered on the page that are created, imposed, and popularized by the scribes and the monks of the British Isles. So England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and the works that were coming out of that and then being transmitted across into the continent. And these insular scribes developed quite a few different ways of helping punctuate their text, not just through symbols, but through page design itself. Now, one of the reasons for this is that if you think about it, Christianity has traveled into the British Isles by this point, and Latin, the language of Western Christianity, is not the primary language. So levels of literacy or levels of kind of classical reading skills are not quite as high when we're talking about this new world of the British Isles, and the monks who are writing there are doing everything they can to make that Latin more transmittable and more recognizable and easier to use. One of my favorite methods that they use is a method called diminuendo, where we start the beginning of a thought unit. In some ways, this is kind of like percola et comata, but rather than having text and major thought units represented and broken down by indentation, we see a major thought unit or the beginning of a sentence start with very, very large text. And then as that word, that first word, is written, and as you carry on reading from left to right, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we're down to the main size of the text to design for that. So in this illustration, you can actually see that happening line after line. We also have the imposition of what's called a hierarchy of scripts, where different script styles are incorporated on the same page in order to represent different kinds of writing. So here we have a number of symbols and script styles that are working together to help tell the reader what's going on. So in terms of the hierarchy of scripts, we have two distinct forms of handwriting. We have uncial handwriting and insular minuscule, and no doubt you will remember these from Professor Lockett's lectures. And in conjunction with these, we also have additional symbols. So the hederi, which is kind of a leaf-like symbol, and diples. And diples are these little things that look vaguely reminiscent of quotation marks, and that's exactly the purpose they serve. So let's take a look at the page on the right, or the image on the right here. If we look at the very, very top line of text, you've got a dipel on the left, followed by the word neck. And then if you follow that line through, you're going to see a change in the style of handwriting. And just before the change in that style of handwriting, you see a hederi, or a leaf symbol, or hedera, a leaf symbol. So what we have here is the hedera is serving as a period. And this is something that was adapted from very, very old Roman systems of rendering kind of sentence ends. So that's telling us we have the end of a sentence or the end of a statement. The dipel is telling us that this is a quotation from a different work. And the uncial script that is being used here, and then as you can see all the way down the page, everywhere we see that uncial script, that is a citation or an extract from an authoritative text. And you can see the dipels at the left of every line with the uncial text, and you can see the hedera at the end of each section of uncial text. And then the insular minuscule that you see is the actual commentary or the added, in quotes, original text that has been added to this manuscript. Another thing that we see here is pronounced word separation. Whether we're looking at the uncial or whether we're looking at the insular minuscule, you're seeing distinct word separation here. So we're starting to see this grammar of legibility where just looking at this page, we have these various visual elements working together to impose meaning. Carrying on with this idea of the grammar of legibility, this is kind of put up a little joke here in the top text on the left, the grammar of illegibility sometimes. The use of like full page and sometimes smaller units of illumination to actually set out the beginnings or breaks in text for major components of text. And here we see a full carpet page from the Book of Kells. And if you look down at the all caps type that I've rendered in the PowerPoint slide here, this is what this design actually spells out. This carpet page is beautiful. It's entirely decorative. It would have taken hours and hours and hours to make. But this isn't just a design. This isn't just Celtic knotwork sitting here to dazzle our eyes. This is actually complete letter work spelling out the beginning of one of the Gospels. And if you follow this through, this would be easier to do if we were all looking at a PowerPoint screen together in a classroom, and I could outline this for you. But if you look at the leftmost shaft that runs the vertical shaft that runs the extent of the page, that is an I, and then you'll see a diagonal line coming down from the top right side of that shaft, joining up to the next vertical shaft, forming an N, and that right vertical shaft then stands in as its own I. Immediately to the right of that, we have a little box with a T, and then across the T laterally is an I. If you drop immediately down and slightly to the right of that kind of compound TI, you have a UM. If you then kick down a little bit more and go off to the left, you're going to see an E, a U, and then an A, kind of a drunken little tipsy A, cocked to the right, and then an N appended to that. Jump all the way across that vertical shaft that forms half or part of the N and the I. If you jump all the way across that, you're going to see a G and an E. And then if you go immediately below that, you'll see L, I. You'll see basically minims. We'll talk about those more in paleography. But you're going to see an L, an I, and an I for Evangelii, followed by an H and a U for, or another I, an H and a U for Yesu. And then if you kick down slightly a little bit on the register and over to the left, you're going to see the letters Chi and Rho, the Greek letters Chi and Rho, and then an I standing for Christi. So this whole carpet page, it's very, very visually dynamic, very beautiful, but it's also entirely a legible script if you know what you're looking at. And this served as the beginning of one of the Gospels, a clear major textual demarcation in the Book of Kells. Other forms of things that work to create a grammar of legibility in insular script are the increasing use of what are called litterae notabiliores, or more notable letters. These are larger letters, and you can see these slightly bigger all the way throughout the text at various different points. Often these litterae notabiliores would be signaled even further through the application of color. And then another form of modified punctuation that the insular scribes introduced was a modification of the distinctiones system, but rather than rendering, for instance, a media distinctio as a punctus put halfway up the line register, or a full on distinctio representing a period at the top register of a written line, they would use built up distinctiones. So right underneath my own little PowerPoint rendition here where I typed out built up distinctiones, I have an example of a full stop period where you're using 3 distinctiones in a particular design group in order to represent the period. You can see that operating here in the Book of Kells. If you look, well, really throughout this page, but if you look at the end of line 2, just before you see these little flower designs, you're going to see a trio of triple distinctions or threefold built-up distinctions. So this modified built-up distinctio system was one of the ways that they also imposed punctuated meaning. Moving out of the insular period, we get into the Carolingian period. So this, the Carolingian innovations to punctuation really kind of are roughly fully developed by the late 8th century, and they remain extremely popular all the way through the 10th and into the early 11th century. And the core concept in the posituri system is this recognition or this imposition of this idea of the litterae absolutae, or absolute and invariable letters. So each letter as a referent of meaning has distinct connotations. So the litterae absolutae were formed, or the idea of it consisted of three main concepts: the figura, or the letter's shape, the nomen, or the letter's name, and the potestas, its power, its sound value, its phonetic referent. So these three things were integral to the idea of each letter of the alphabet. In order to help define this and put this idea into practice, the Carolingians appropriated the system of the ancient distinctiones and insular built-up distinctions and created a new system of punctuation where the value was not determined by position or number of points, but was actually determined by the shape. So now we're starting to get into the idea of modern punctuation, where we have different shaped marks rendering different types of meaning. So there were four major types of posituri marks, and then a fifth that came in a little bit later in the period, but was really not used all that often. And these marks are the punctus, which is a minor pause, so a simple point. And you can see the renditions in the illustrations that I put in on the right of this slide, running downwards. So you have a simple point for the punctus, representing a minor pause or a comma. The punctus elevatus, which looks a little bit like a period with either a right sweeping or a left sweeping swoosh. That is the punctus elevatus, and that's a major medial pause or a colon. The punctus versus, which is going to be your strongest pause, and that's a period symbol with like a backward 7 written underneath it. So that will be the period. The punctus interrogativus, which is a question mark. And that looks much like our question mark, but sometimes the little curly Q of our question mark might be rendered either to the left or to the right. Usually, in my experience, it's going to sweep off to the right, but it's going to be off at a distinct angle or sometimes even flat to the line of writing. And that fifth symbol that was introduced but wasn't particularly popular, was the punctus flexus, which is this minor medial pause, roughly a semicolon. And that's going to be a punctus mark with like the number 3 written above it, or a reverse number 3 written above it. So these marks, and rather than placement on the line, these different shaped marks were what imposed meaning for the Carolingian system. In addition to this, the other major innovation of the Carolingian period is that this is the first time where we start to see a distinct use of capital letters and a pretty consistent use of capital letters to help demarcate the beginning of new sentences. So what we've got here on this slide is a page from St. Augustine's Tractatus in Evangelium Johannis. So this is a commentary on the Gospel of John. And I'm going to count off about 10 or 15 seconds in my own head, but I encourage you also to pause here and see how many different punctuation marks you can identify and what line numbers they're on. So in this case, we're looking for the punctus elevatus, the punctus interrogativus, and the punctus flexus. So I'll just pause here for a second. Okay, were you able to find any of these? And if so, where were they? Well, just to aid you with some review, I've identified the line numbers for a number of these marks. And again, I encourage you to pause, work through this yourself, take a look and familiarize yourself with these shapes and their placement. High and late medieval punctuation picks up on the posituri system and really starts to, I wouldn't say develop it so much as modify it a little bit. And in many cases, that modification winds up equating to simplification. And sometimes I think outright laziness when I'm really, stuck into a 14th century manuscript and wish I was seeing a punctus elevatus and all I'm seeing are, the simple punctus placed over and over and over again. But by this point, modern writing conventions have been firmly established, with word separation really coming to the fore in the 12th century. I want to take a moment to pause and say, take me at my word. When you start looking at a lot of the really fully developed Gothic bookhands and that compressed script, it's going to seem to you probably that there isn't word separation. But even within highly compressed scripts like that, we do have word separation. So word separation is very, very consistent by the time we get to the 12th century, despite how compressed a script might be. We're also seeing uniform letter forms within all of the different distinct scripts that we might see regionally across Europe. So we might have a Southern textualis or a Northern textualis Gothic bookhand, with variations between the way it's rendered in France, the way it's rendered in England, Italy, Germany. But we're going to see a consistency in the approach to what that letter form is and what its signification is. So that Carolingian notion of literae absolutae is carrying forward into this later medieval period. We'll see this punctuation by modified or abbreviated positurae and distinctiones systems, and sometimes a complete falling back on an ultra basic distinctio system where only a single point is used to kind of just mark pauses. And we also see the consistent use of capital letters, very often with a splash of color, just a quick stroke in red usually. During this period, we also see, though, increasing complexity in how punctuation is used, and one could say inconsistency, because there's a growth and continuing development of specialized genres during this period, as we see the rise of the urban schools in the 11th and 12th century, ultimately leading to the universities. As we see, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries, we see all sorts of different movements of monastic reform. All of these developments create specialized audiences that use punctuation in different ways to impose kind of a corporate identity or to impose specialized corporate meaning for their own particular purposes. So you see liturgical uses of punctuation that are going to vary drastically from the way punctuation is used in legal documents. Or the way that it's used in academic or like theological, legal, canon law and civil law, medical, grammatical texts, and how it's used in literary texts. And then you'll also see variations in how punctuation is used between what might be common Latin texts and the emerging vernaculars. One of my favorite things to observe about punctuation marks, and one of the most useful things to observe about punctuation marks, if you're not necessarily considering what the text actually says. If you're working with liturgical manuscripts, very often if you see a punctus flexus mark, that least used of the positurae system, a handy little tip is you can see those and pretty much know you're going to be looking at a Cistercian or a Carthusian monastic manuscript as opposed to a Benedictine manuscript or a Franciscan or a Dominican manuscript as you get further into the Middle Ages. So it's just one example of how these symbols don't just represent pauses for breath, beginnings of new sentences, questions and exclamations and things like that. You can also use these punctuation marks to help you identify the communities that were making and using these manuscripts in many cases. All of this led to kind of more complex and creative page layouts, because we do have a slight, as I mentioned before, a slight devolution back into the use of modified positurae and distinctiones systems. So we start to see refinement and adaptation and appropriation of kind of those earlier insular grammar of legibility forms. So we have increased use of literae notabiliores. We've got lots of flourishing around those bigger letters and those rubricated letters. The increased use of rubrication and decoration to set off different components of text. And we looked at some of that in Codicology II lectures. And also the development of additional symbols to be used alongside distinctiones marks and alongside positurae marks. And two of the big ones for this are the paragraphus and the virgulae. So virgulae just be a stroke that is marking a division, a paragraphus or a pilcro, a paraph mark. That can also be used to help not just mark divisions in kind of like narrative text, but those can also be used to help set off items and lists and things like that. And those become very, very popular visual cues within later medieval manuscripts. Finally, we get to the humanistic period, and this really starts in the late 14th and carries on through the 15th century. And this was largely driven by Italian scholars. And the Italian humanists, broadly speaking, everything is a lot more complex than this, but broadly speaking, one of their highest goals was to achieve ultimate elegance and eloquence in their writing. and in their compositions. And in order to do this, they wound up searching for the oldest texts they could find. They wanted to return to this notion of the classical ideal. Luckily for us, they didn't quite do this. Otherwise, we might all be writing in Scriptura Continua today. But the oldest texts and the classical texts that they did encounter typically were preserved in Carolingian manuscripts. So they became exposed once again to fully developed forms of the posituri system. And they took this form and ran with it and adapted it for their own purposes in order to create a much more nuanced system of punctuation that started to introduce a lot of the modern marks that we're seeing. So we start to see the question mark move into a more vertical axis, the way that we're used to seeing it. We see the introduction of the semicolon, the exclamation point, parentheses, all of these things. And by the mid-15th century, what we now think of as the modern punctuation system is largely complete. And by about the mid-15th century, when we start to see printing emerge, that humanistic imposed punctuation system is largely going to be set. And this becomes really what we use today. So if we step back to Scriptura Continua for a second and think about that as a neutral text where the ideal is that the reader or the reciter is supposed to assign the punctuation and the stops in breath and the rhythm and the nuance. We have a reader imposed system of punctuation. We've gone 180 degrees by the time we get to the end of the Middle Ages, and we're in the humanistic period where writers are expected, and the desire is that they impose meaning themselves in order for readers to have an easier time in interpretation and to actually see the variety of individual authorial styles. So it's this 180 degree shift. So that brings to a close our punctuation lecture. There are 2 more units to to Codicology III. We're going to be talking about correction styles and correction systems and methods in manuscripts, and we're going to be talking about glossing and annotation systems. So join me for those in separate files. Okay, thank you very much.